I don't know how many of you know John West, but any Sitecore developer in the community would not know, without know John, who's John West. John has been around for a long time, and if you Google it for any Sitecore problem, the first blog that you get is John West blog, right? So how it's all started for John West. John started with Sitecore in 2004 while he was trying to research on a legacy content management system, and he found Sitecore. That's when he started with Sitecore. He was fixing fax machines and answering support calls and things like that. So I would like to welcome John West to come and talk about his Sitecore story. And again, thanks a lot for having John West to come down to Cincinnati and provide his honor his presence in Cincinnati, and then kick off this Cincinnati Sitecore User Group. John West.
Normally, when I do these things, I try and have a really technical presentation, and unfortunately, I don't have any technical content at this point, so that could be a good thing or a bad thing. If people are here to learn something, this probably isn't the event for that. I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is John West. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Sitecore in North America, and that's a really misleading title. So, Chief Technology Officer, everybody probably has an idea of what I should do. That's probably not what I do. I've had almost every possible technical role in Sitecore while I've been with the company, and I'll get to that in a moment. You know, from Suresh mentioned, I built networks and fixed fax machines, but I was also involved in technical sales and documentation, and I was an instructor. And now the title that I would give myself would be Chief Developer Advocate, because I'm always trying to look at the product from your perspective as a partner or a customer, instead of from an internal marketing perspective. So really seeing what the product looks like when it gets into your hands, and then working as an advocate for you within the company to fix the product or to implement features that are requested commonly. Or it's not all about the product, it's also about the organization. So connecting people and getting their questions answered, but most important for me has been fostering the developer community and helping us learn from each other, and that's really the most important thing that I do. And reality is that role is over. This is my kind of farewell tour, because they've put me into a new role where I'm supposed to be responsible for technical architecture of Sitecore web properties. So if you think of the Sitecore marketing site, or the partner network, or the community site, the documentation site, all of the new sites that we've been putting out recently, I'm supposed to be architecting those solutions so we can get more value out of them and use them as showcases for Sitecore technology. So that's a real stretch for me. I've always been really shallow in Sitecore technology. I've never actually managed an implementation or developed one end-to-end, other than the one that I built before I joined Sitecore. It never went to production. So I have no real production experience with Sitecore. I just have a lot of theory and things that I've read and heard about Sitecore. So I got way ahead of myself there, and I'll just reset and say, you know, welcome to the inaugural user group for Cincinnati. Thanks for being here. And also thanks for being part of the Sitecore community. Again, community is really important to me. Events like this where people share not just their knowledge, but their interests and their advocacy and all of their personality really benefit the community and benefit Sitecore and all of us that are involved. So how many people here would call themselves developers, or more on the technology side than on the business side? Is almost everybody technical? Or? That's usually what we get for user groups. Sitecore really is a development platform, and so historically it's always been attractive to developers and almost a hard sell into the business, because they don't necessarily see the value of the architecture and things like that. Over time, we've moved much more towards the business side of things. So, like Speak is really about having very intuitive user interfaces for business users, where things like the content editor were less business user friendly, or the page editor itself is much more user friendly than kind of our historical user interfaces. I'll just mention, if you've ever looked at Sitecore's MVC implementation, it's really been static for a long time, really since 6.6, and I've been managing an MVC task force for the last couple of years, and we finally have some momentum to get some improvements around MVC. So in the 8.1 release that we're expecting in October, we expect that there will be some improvements for developers that are focused on MVC, and so that might be a time to reconsider MVC. So So just another curiosity question. How many people are working with Sitecore 8 or have worked with Sitecore 8? Relatively small numbers. How many people are working on 7 or have worked with 7? I would expect almost everybody on 7. I must see some 6s out there. Who's on the 6?
We have some clients.
Right. Anybody going back to 5 here?
I've used 5. Does that count? I was even certified on 5. How does that count?
Great. So we got another 5 user. I actually go back to Sitecore 4, and Sitecore 4 is a really funny product because in 2004 when I joined the company, Sitecore 4 was a great product. It was the best CMS on the market, but now if I look at it, it really looks like a toy. It's an embarrassing toy and the APIs were completely different. You had a different API for working with items in the master database than in the web database, and you had a different technique for managing different layouts for different devices called layout groups. Most people are probably not familiar with those. Luckily, in Sitecore 5, we had masters, and we got rid of those in Sitecore 6, so if you're familiar with that concept. There's a little bit of legacy in Sitecore, which would be things like the concept of masters, the term masters. But what's really surprising about it is that the architecture from Sitecore 4 is almost the core functionality, that what I call the 10 fundamental concepts like templates and fields and items and layouts and renderings and placeholders. All of that stuff is basically the same as it was 10 years ago. The only difference of those fundamental concepts is the difference between devices and layout groups. And I'm not going to get into that distinction, but that makes it pretty clear to me that Sitecore had a really good architecture from the beginning, because it's really easy to build things on top of a solid architecture. It's really hard to re-architect something. And so they got a lot of stuff right in the first place. And I have a lot of respect for the guys that did that at original work. I mean, some of the sharpest developers that I've ever worked with are still working for Sitecore. So I take a little bit of pride in the product, I'll be honest about it, even though I didn't write it. So some of my goals for today, I mentioned it's not a technical presentation. I don't have any slides. I don't have anything really significant to say. I don't even have an agenda. I just have some notes that I wrote in the last couple of minutes. And my goal here is to just help us understand the value of fostering the community. I'll mention this and I'll repeat it at the end, but when you go out and present yourself as a subject matter expert, that's what makes you a subject matter expert. So when I joined Sitecore, I didn't know anything about Sitecore, but I just started writing about it. We started a Yahoo group, if anybody remembers Yahoo, and we just started sharing information that way, and that really is what led me to where I am today. Just, you are what you make yourself. And so if you go out there and start blogging and start trying to be an expert in a certain aspect of Sitecore, you're going to end up being the expert in that subject, and that brings a lot of business to your organization. So benefiting from their work, and I want other people to benefit from my work. So I think it's really important to share information, and especially for the younger developers that don't have a lot of experience, to make Sitecore's got a pretty steep learning curve. I mean, day one can be pretty brutal if you've never done a CMS implementation, if you've never done an ASP.NET project before. People will ask newbie questions no matter what you do. They will ask questions instead of trying to make people feel kind of silly and go do the research. I always try and help them with those easy questions. Everybody has the same questions when they start working with the CMS platform, and it's not necessarily clear to people where the starting points are. So the greatest starting point is training, but the community can also be a great starting point for developers that need to come up quickly. And a lot of people get thrown into projects and don't really have time to go back and do the research and read the book or whatever it is, and they just need to get the problem solved right away. So I think it's really important to help all the developers that are out there. And it was interesting because I was talking to, but they were just within the last 20 minutes, somebody was talking about one of the open source products in their community and how kind of exclusive it is, or how daunting it is to try and join that community. And I don't ever want to work in that kind of community. I want to work in a place where everybody appreciates each other and benefits from each other. And I feel partially responsible for fostering that kind of community within Sitecore. So I've worked with other enterprise CMS vendors, and they've made strong efforts to hide their knowledge of their own product, so that you'd have to pay for professional services to really get the value out of the product. And I really disagree with that. I almost disagree with charging for software in the first place, but for charging for information, I just see as wrong. Like the New York Times, the fact that I can't go there without paying for a subscription is just wrong to me. I think information should be free. So again, we're all benefiting from information that other people have compiled, and we need to keep amassing that human knowledge. Okay, so now I'm going to go back through my Sitecore story, which is kind of how I joined the company and the different roles that I've done there. And I'm going to go all the way back to when I was 5 years old, because when I was 5, I ended up with a mechanical typewriter. So no electricity, no screen, just hammer on the keys really hard. And it was really cool because it had a special shift key where you could type in red, so that the ink ribbon actually moved up and down so you could type in red. But what that taught me was how to type, and how to type without making errors, because in the days of typewriters, making an error was really expensive. You had to correct it and go through these processes. And so that, I think, has actually made me a more productive programmer. I can probably type 90 to 120 words per minute, and that lets me produce blogs and code. I can type code almost as fast as I can type text. So that's been a really valuable thing for me. The next stage in my career in information technology was when I was about 10 or 11 in 5th grade. My teacher brought a VIC-20 to school. And the VIC-20, anybody ever worked on a VIC-20? Anybody know what a VIC-20 is? So everybody knows what a Commodore 64 is, right? Yes. That's a Commodore, we got a VIC-20 user back there? I don't know. Commodore 64.
No, I know the Commodore.
Okay. Commodore 64 is one of the early computing platforms. It was a home computer. It was a lot like this laptop. It had a keyboard, but it didn't have a screen. And you would plug it into a TV, and when you turned it on, it was basically a basic interpreter. This is how computing was in the early days. And so if you bought a computer at that time, you had to be a programmer. You could either plug in cartridges and play games, or you could turn it on and boot into the basic interpreter and start typing code. So that had 64K of memory, but the first machine I used had 3.5K of memory. That was literally, that was the complete system. And my 5th grade teacher was able to program in BASIC tic-tac-toe on that system. And I thought that was incredible, and I stepped up to the challenge and tried to write Connect 4, and I couldn't do it. 3.5K of memory, I just couldn't do it. So, but what I learned from that was that the computer would do the math. So I like math, but I don't like operating. I don't like doing the math operations. So I like telling somebody else to do the math operations, and I figured out that I could tell the computer to do the mathematical operations so that I wouldn't have to do that busy work. And that was really amazing to me, that I could tell something to think for me. That was a revolution for me. My parents didn't understand it. They thought that it was that I was playing games, or that I was trying to get a TV in my room so I could watch TV at night. Because literally you plug the computer into the TV. But anyway, my brothers and I, we pooled our Christmas money that we got from my grandparents, and we bought a Commodore 64 based on that experience. My brothers really did use it as a gaming platform. If you remember Jumpman or some of the other early games out there. But I was reading the reference manuals. There was a magazine called Byte where it would actually do code listings. You couldn't download back then. There was no internet, so you had to either exchange tapes with friends or type the code yourself. And we had a tape drive, so we were able to save our programs and play them on my dad's audio system here. It's like a program on audio tape is like an endless 56K modem connector. It's a horrible sound, but it was interesting. So my parents were against it, and for that reason I kind of dropped out of computing while I was in high school. And then when I got to college, a friend of mine had a CompuServe account. And then that was another, I'm always looking for these kind of paradigm shifts. And for me, CompuServe was a paradigm shift. It was kind of before the internet, or at the same time as the internet, but it was competing with the internet in a way. But I started to see the value of the internet. And I studied all sorts of different things in college. And then towards the end of college, I realized I didn't have very good career prospects. And so I went back and decided, well, I've been reading all these C programming books on the side, and reading all these magazines about programming. Why didn't I study that? So I decided to stay in college a little bit longer. My whole career is just being in the right place at the right time. I've just been extremely lucky to get to where I am. I am hardworking, and I have some work ethic, but it's also I've just been extremely lucky. So based on the books I've been reading and things like that, I was able to skip a bunch of prerequisites in college and go straight into a relational database administration course. And the first day of class, the teacher asked, I need a TA. Does anybody want to be my TA? And 150 people walked out of the room, and I was the only person that walked up to the podium and said, of course I want to be the TA. Why would who would walk away from that opportunity? So I graded labs and managed records for grade keeping and things like that. And I was going to use that professor as a reference for my summer job search. And he said, no, don't bother looking for a job. I run a consultancy on the side, so why don't you just come work for my consultancy? And I had a year of training in computer information systems. I had no business going into anything in the real world. So I started working at his consultancy doing EDI work. I've got any EDI people here?
I'm showing my age, aren't I?
So EDI was a way of doing electronic commerce before the internet. So you would have these standards for documents, kind of similar to XML, but with a much more, XML is a really wasteful structure, opening and closing tags and all that kind of stuff. We just had data delimiter, and then line feed was another kind of delimiter. And so you would, yeah, exactly, perfect. And you would exchange these documents with your trading partners over what were called value-added networks. So the internet didn't really exist, and if it did exist, it wasn't secure. So these big companies would exchange purchase orders and inventory reports and test results and point-of-sale data. All this kind of stuff would come through these value-added networks, with a dial-up connection to basically a modem bank that GE or somebody else like that would run, that all the other trading partners would connect to. And you would exchange documents that they would sit in the van until you picked them up, and then you would put your acknowledgments on the van, and the other partners would pick them up. I had learned a little bit about how to use computers, but that taught me how businesses work, all of the different business processes in the organization. And so that was a great experience for me, and I did that for a couple of years. But what's similar, so EDI is similar to web content management in that it's a hub. The CMS often becomes a hub for all sorts of different applications within the organization. You've got your CRM ties into the CMS, or your inventory. If you're doing e-commerce, you need to flow inventory controls through the CMS, or at least tie it into the data about the products that you're selling online. Pricing and all of the systems connect to the web content management system in the same way that they connect to the EDI system. So that background in EDI was a good background to building kind of a hub application, which turned out to be content management for me. So that was in 1996. I swear I was doing e-commerce in 1996. So after a year of training, which really wasn't even appropriate training, the first EDI system that I built was for a company called Xilinx, which is a silicon. They make field programmable gate arrays in the Valley. That system processed $300 million worth of invoices in the first year with only 2 errors, and those 2 errors came from data in the upstream system. So I had a lot of confidence from this experience. I thought I could do anything, and this was kind of when the .com was happening, so it looked like money was just ridiculously easy to make. And so I quit and went back to school because I hadn't finished my degree. My professor had kind of pulled me out of school to do this work. And so I went back to school, and I found school to be really boring. After 3 years in the industry, I knew I could go make money, and I knew I could learn on the job. But in school, I felt like I was teaching the teachers sometimes, and especially the other students. And then I met my wife, and school was over, and I got into the .com at the very end, and I did EDI in the .com period, and then I think this was when Monster started. I put my resume online, and I got a call from a recruiter in San Diego that had an Interwoven practice. Has anybody ever worked with Interwoven? So Interwoven was a web content management system. It was really the market leader in the web content management space from maybe 2000 to 2003, something like that. And so I went, after having access or exposure to all these different types of business systems, Interwoven, that experience, I worked on probably 20 different projects in maybe 15 different verticals. So healthcare, finance, tractors, corn, hybrid corn. I mean, I worked for Intel, I worked for John Deere, I worked for US Bank. I worked on all these different projects all for all these different industries. And what I'm trying to get out with that is that I was always learning, always trying to challenge myself. Not, oh, I'm an EDI programmer that knows how to work in the silicone industry, but I want to do lots of different technologies and work with lots of different companies, or lots of different industries. And so not being afraid of that, I think in computer information systems, it's important that we're always learning. You never want to stop learning because that's kind of the end of your career from my perspective. The technology is going to change. The half-life of information in our field is maybe 2 years. In 2 years, about half of what you know right now is going to be obsolete. And that's just the reality. And that's not going to slow down. It's going to speed up. You can see it happening with phones and everything. So you have to be constantly willing to learn. And I love that because I don't ever want to slow down. I always want to be learning more information. So I did interwoven projects for about 5 years. And it was great. It was the dot-com period, so I was doing projects in Europe, and they'd fly me all over the place with my wife, and money was just all over the place, and it was just a great experience. But then I got really tired of interwoven. It was a Perl. Anybody program Perl? Do you miss it? Perl. So I recommend reading a Perl book if you've never looked at Perl, because it's probably the most cryptic language I've ever used. Maybe TCL/TK if you kind of close it. So I got kind of tired of interwoven, and what was happening for me is that companies were bringing me in to look at their interwoven implementation and say, we want to replace this. And so I was doing a lot of research on what other CMS platforms are available, and this was about the time that .NET was really starting to be real. And so Stanford Hospitals and Clinics brought me in to do 3 months of research on what CMS products were available, and they wanted a .NET platform, but there really weren't any products because .NET was relatively new. There were a lot of vendors that would say it was a .NET platform, but it wasn't really a .NET platform. And somehow I found Sitecore, which is really strange because Sitecore was a Danish company. They had no marketing at all. They really, the only way they could sell was through word of mouth and through just having good technology. And I'm the kind of person that, I remember my first exchange with Biana, who was the president of North American Operations. I sent him an email and I said, can you send me the software? And he wrote back and he said, well, no, I'll send you some brochures. And I wrote back and I said, I don't want your glossies. And he remembers this specifically because this is his worst possible prospect. He's a sales guy and he just wants to put his marketing collateral in my hands and sell me the kind of the dream where all I want to see is the reality. And so anyway, that's how I got into Sitecore. And I took the training and I was really impressed with the architecture of the product. So I could see through their lack of marketing and their poor communications. And the reality was that 90% of the work that I had done would have been unnecessary if I had had this platform from the beginning. So all the infrastructure that I developed for Intel, for workflow management and converting XML to other formats and things like that, if I had just had Sitecore, I could have really focused on the business problem that I was trying to solve and building the website instead of the infrastructure that was necessary to build a website. And so I was just really impressed with the product, and I told Biana, whether Stanford chooses to buy this or not, I want to work with this product. And I was coming from 5 years of technical consulting, so I wanted to be a technical consultant for Sitecore. And Sitecore's model is to not do technical consulting. So there was no opportunity for me at Sitecore based on my current role. So this was kind of the next major transition in my career. I moved from being an implementation specialist to being a technical sales engineer, which that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do because I'm going from working in a cubicle and programming by myself to having to be really customer-facing and political and all of this kind of stuff that was really difficult for me and much more social, had a much more social nature to it. So I'm always trying to push myself a little bit further and take risks like that. And so this was 2004, and I met with Biana, and we met in Mads' house because they didn't even have an office, and they offered me $32,000 a year right after I had just signed a mortgage for my first mortgage, and I was probably making, I don't know, 100 working for Interwoven at the time. And my wife was completely against it. She was just shocked that I would consider, how are we going to possibly pay the mortgage if you join this company? But I was hooked. I mean, the technology, so I was willing to take the risk. And that risk has really paid off. And so things are, you know, never as bad as you fear and never as good as you hope. So, you know, it could have gone bad, but I could have always gone back to Interwoven or EDI or some other thing. So I just want to encourage people to take those kind of risks for themselves. Like Suresh is a good example. He could have just gone on being a contractor, consultant, doing the IT work, but instead he said, I want to start a business. And that's a really fulfilling thing to do, because you're making careers for other people, you're working for yourself, you have a lot more control of your organization and your culture and those kind of things. So I'm not trying to tell all your employees to jump off and start their own companies, but it is a really valuable thing to do at some point. So I recommend, you know, taking those kind of risks. So I did almost every different possible technical role for Sitecore. I was an instructor. Did anybody take a course from me? This would have been like 7 or 8 years ago. So I probably taught maybe 50 courses on Sitecore 4 and Sitecore 5 all over North America, so United States and Canada. I did a lot of sales demos, so showing the product online and answering questions about it. Did a lot of RFP responses and wrote a lot of documentation. But again, I started that Yahoo forum, that Yahoo group, and that really was my primary accomplishment back then, I would say, was starting the community that almost didn't exist at that point. So after about 3 years of doing the traveling, consulting, technical sales role, I was really burnt out on the travel. I visited the same cities in the same states 20 times, and I just didn't really want to do it anymore. And so we also had a huge gap in our documentation. So I joined the documentation team for about 3 years. If any of you have ever looked at the PDFs that we had out there on the old SDN, kind of all the presentation component references, cookbooks, client configuration cookbook, data definition, those kind of things are all, I wrote the original drafts of all of those. So that was, I spent about 3 years on that project. And I felt like we got to the documentation to a point where there wasn't a whole lot of value that I could add. And then I started the blogging. The real reason I did the blogging was because I was answering the same questions over and over again, and I would be looking for code on my hard drive, or where did I put those notes, and I could never find anything because I was always reinstalling XP or moving to a different laptop, and I wouldn't have my old files. So I decided if I just put this archive on the web, I'll be able to find what I'm looking for, and I never really expected that anybody else would read it. It was just kind of a place for me to drop my stuff. Before Bitbucket and stuff like that was really out there. So that's how the blog got started. And at that time I was working as what we call the consulting product architect. So I would take builds of the product before they hit the market and look at them from the customer's perspective. So what new features are in the product, try to compare the new version and the old version, and write some blog posts about the differences to kind of help with the education thing, because it's much easier to blog about technical information than it is to write professional documentation about it. So our documentation always has gaps, and the blog started to fill some of those gaps, and then the blog really took off, and Sitecore started to see the value of the blog, but also the value of having that kind of presence in the community. And then the book project came along, and the book, it's another thing that I'm proud to have gotten done, but I would never do again. It was literally the hardest project I've ever done in my life, and the only project for which I've been responsible for delayed deliverables. So I can't even tell you how much work it is. They gave me 3 months to write it, and that wasn't that bad because I can type and because I had a lot of the content from the blogs, but really the editorial process was a disaster. It was just horrendous. They wanted, everything had to have a screenshot, and I'm not a screenshotting kind of person. Every word had to be grammatically consistent, and that was just a daunting process. We had a child during that 6-month period, and we relocated twice, and we had a basement flood. So it was just a really challenging time in my life, and I wouldn't do it again. It's also really difficult to schedule a physical book release with a software product release. So the book stops at Sitecore 6.5. If you're not familiar with the book, I do recommend that you read the book. I'd say almost all of the information is still relevant to 7 and to 8. There's a lot of stuff about XDB that is obviously not in the book. MVC is not in the book. The content search APIs are not in the book. But all of the fundamental concepts and a lot of extension point information and things that you can do with the product are covered in the book pretty well. So I think it is a good introduction to Sitecore still. Kind of lost track of what I did for a while, I guess. I don't know what I was doing, probably a lot of blogging. And then I guess about a year and a half ago, we were going to do a new documentation site because everybody always complains about the PDFs. So we had a goal of doing documentation as HTML, and Sitecore had a project, but it was really in bad shape. So this was actually the first Sitecore implementation that I'd really been involved with. I'd done a prototype for Stanford, but it never went into production. So this was the first time I'd actually worked on a Sitecore solution. And I didn't really work on the solution. I did some prototypes. Like if you read my blog, you might have seen one for converting Word documents to HTML. That's actually a piece of the documentation site that we use. So our documentation people work in Word, and they use something based on a prototype that I wrote to convert their Word documents to HTML with. So that's not really Sitecore. That's a lot of Word APIs and things like that. So I can't say that it was even a Sitecore implementation for me. I did some coding about Sitecore. So unfortunately, based on that, the success of that project, and by success I mean the solution's in production, it performs, it doesn't fall over. I don't mean everybody's happy with the content, because I can't control the content on the site or even the structure of the content, but I can say that the project went into production and it was considered a success relative to some other sites that Sitecore's released. Sitecore is very good at building CMS technology, but historically very poor at building websites with its own technology. So we really should use partners to implement our solutions instead of trying to implement them in-house. So that's why they put me in this new role that basically starts on Monday, which is Chief Architect for Web Properties is my new role. I don't know if they're going to change my title, but that's what I'm doing going forward, and that's pretty much how I got here. So we're going to have a questions and answers session later, but that's kind of my whole story, and I don't know if that's a conclusion or not. That's where it is. I'm just going to go back and say a couple of things I already said. I mean, always embrace new technologies. You want to look at what's happening and read about it, and what's interesting or what's compelling, follow it. I mean, even if it doesn't have any business value for you today, pay attention to it, because if it's interesting to you, I love to do things that are interesting to me. And if I can make money doing something that I enjoy doing, that's much more fun than making money doing something that I know I can do. So learn something new and find the opportunity there. I would also say study all the aspects of the business. So just because you work in accounts receivable or work on an accounts receivable system, that doesn't mean that you can't look at an accounts payable system and figure out how that system works or how it ties into the company. And that's just a small example, but I would also say try and work in as many verticals as you can, so as many different industries as you can to get the exposure. I mean, work for charities, work for corporations, work for everybody that you can. One of the nice things that happened to me is I've worked as a full-time employee as implementing software solutions, as a consultant helping other organizations implement software solutions, and as a vendor selling software solutions. And that has given me a kind of broad perspective on how the whole software industry works. And you get different perspectives based on which of those you are. I think consulting is really the best role personally, but it's interesting to see it from all the different angles. I want to just say again, foster the community, help each other come up and do your blogging and share information that way, or at user groups, or on LinkedIn, or however you choose to share your information. I really recommend that you reach out and connect with other developers. And if you can, mentor the other developers. So take somebody under your wing. If you're experienced with Sitecore, find somebody who's not and help them move up the ladder. Because you are the experts. You guys, a lot of you are probably better at implementing Sitecore solutions than I would be. So share that expertise. And again, when you publish, when you blog about something, that's what makes you a subject matter expert. And so I highly recommend that you invest in doing that. And part of that is you do want to steer contacts towards your company, but you also want to market yourself. So if you can make a name for yourself as a specialist in some technology, that's a really good thing in your career. And Sitecore is a great career to be in. CMS is a great space to be in, and you're working with one of the really, what I think is the best vendor in the space, and also probably the market leader in terms of number of clients and things like that. We have a couple of competitors that are probably a little bit bigger, but in terms of focus and potential, I really think that Sitecore has huge potential ahead of it still, and it's in the whole experience management area. That's all I have. Thanks for your time.
Another applause to John West. Thanks a lot for and John is going to the model. Like, he's the #1 post and response in the SDN. I don't know how many of you guys got SDN. He got about 8,708 posts and replies for the back in the time 2008 Sitecore. John was always responsive to my forum posts and his replies and things like that. And he even personally sent me emails about some packages and things like that at the time. So thanks again, John, for helping us out.